Rousseau, the first true human being. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a self-described contrarian. Although a product of the Enlightenment, he became the first to attack it from within. And as a result, he alienated himself from all the Enlightenment thinkers of his day. All on his own, and decades ahead of his time, he began a new movement in philosophy, which after his death turned into an entire new time period in Western history, namely the Romantic period, which besides new philosophical ideas, also inspired writers such as Goethe, musicians such as Beethoven, and painters such as Caspar David Friedrich. For a long time, however, I avoided a deep dive into his life and work, as some of his ideas have been rejected in modern times. He rejected reason, for instance, which seems by definition unwise. He claimed tribal life was peaceful, which is factually incorrect. His rejection of private property and merit contained the same flaws that Marxism would later suffer from. And he obsessed over feelings, starting the narcissistic focus on the self and the uncontrolled spewing of emotions that are still current in Western civilization. Yet, as I shall argue, there is much to gain by studying his work. He made the strongest case up to his day of how inequality can cause problems in society. He made the case that modern life has alienated us from our deeper selves, and he then suggested ways to find ourselves again. But most importantly, Rousseau became the first in history to reveal his internal world completely, including his flaws and his darkest secrets, and without an ulterior motive. Earlier St. Augustine had also revealed his deepest flaws, but only as an aid to teach others the way to God. So he had a theological motive. And Petrarca, the first humanist of the Renaissance, had tried the same, but his attempt was somewhat stiff and he did not turn every stone. Rousseau, in contrast, wrote an autobiography for its own sake and without filters, believing that an honest story of his life was a worthy read in and of itself, requiring no other motives. And as a result, by the end of this lecture, you will have fallen somewhat in love with Rousseau. And as he himself admits, you will be horrified by him at times too. But at least you have seen now, for the first time in history, a depiction of a real human. So we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived in the 18th century, was the first Romantic philosopher, instigating a whole new time period in Western philosophy, which also spilled over into the arts. Rousseau was very early with this, as during his life, and even a few decades after, the previous time period, the Enlightenment, was still at its peak. To give an idea, Rousseau died the same year as the great Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. And the French Revolution, which enshrined Enlightenment ideals into law, was at the time of his death still over 10 years away. So let's give a quick recap of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment promised a better world based on reason and science, and one free of tyranny and dogmatic religion. And this promise created intense optimism in the West, which the historian and diplomat Louis-Philippe Ségur described as follows. Without regret for the past or anxiety for the future, we walked gaily, that is happily, on a carpet of flowers that concealed an abyss, referring to the bloodshed that would be part of the French Revolution. All that was ancient seemed to us wearisome and ridiculous, and the gravity of all doctrines oppressed us. We were ready to follow with enthusiasm the philosophical doctrines advanced by bold and brilliant leaders. Voltaire appealed to our intelligence, and Rousseau touched our hearts. In line with this optimism, in 1791, 2 years into the French Revolution, a recently built church was turned into a secular monument. It became, quote, a temple to humanity, dedicated to the heroes of the revolution, and it was renamed the Pantheon. Voltaire and Rousseau were deemed their greatest heroes, and their sarcophagi were brought to the Pantheon in a big parade, with more than 100,000 Parisians watching in the streets. And there in the catacombs of the Pantheon, they can still be admired. But while the advocates of the French Revolution could name Voltaire and Rousseau in one breath, they were in many ways diametrically opposed. For Rousseau claimed that reason, which was deified by the Enlightenment project, sounded good, but in reality alienated mankind both from nature and himself. An over-reliance on reason, he claimed, had not liberated us, but had corrupted our nature. A very different approach. Earlier, the famous Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Hobbes had claimed that men in their natural tribal state, back in the caveman days, had been violent, and to protect people from this violence, government was necessary. And this was his justification for a government. But Rousseau, in contrast, romanticized tribal life, stating, quote, nothing is so gentle as man in his primitive state. And this vision of primitive man was during his lifetime already associated with the term noble savage, although Rousseau did not coin or use this term himself. But it was the term that finally stuck. Rousseau explained his reasoning in his discourse on the origins of inequality. And in this text he claimed our ancestors had been naturally good in their tribal days. And this was because they had infrequent contact with one another, and as a result the concept of private property had not yet formed. It was, we read, a time before those dreadful words thine and mine were invented, and before some people craved excessive luxuries, while others starved of hunger. And as a result, because they did not yet have this, tribal people saw no need to hurt or dominate each other. But then something changed. Rousseau hypothesized that perhaps natural catastrophes brought people together into territorial proximity, and this made property scarce. And being so close to one another, they also began to see slight natural differences, which would have been insignificant in tribal days. The cleverest and the strongest characters, he reasoned, must have been able to work the soil better, allowing them produce a little bit more food. And the most eloquent individuals used their clever words to convince others that the soil had become their legitimate property. And there we have the invention of property, according to Rousseau. And this, Rousseau claimed, created civilization. We read, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, thought up the statement, this is mine, and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. By observing these differences, the more skilled individuals also developed an artificial amour-propre, or a love of self, that made them think better of themselves compared to others, and also made them believe that they deserved more than others. And this created social hierarchies. And as the opinions of others started to matter, the savage who had before lived within himself now came to live in the opinion of others. And as a result, he claimed, humans lost their true self. And also, as the newly formed elite had their property to lose, they benefited from peace. And as a result, they tricked the poor into giving up their rights to their share of the property, in exchange for protection by a government. And this, he then claimed, was the government that the Enlightenment figures, such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, had defended. John Locke, for instance, had claimed that a government was instated to protect property, which he thought was a good thing. But Rousseau said this was not a good at all, but a hoax perpetrated by the rich on the poor to institutionalize economic inequality. And this inequality in turn became the source of endless strife. That is, government had not prevented Hobbes' state of nature, which I hope you remember he believed was a state of violence, but instead it had caused the violence. For Rousseau believed that in our tribal days we were all peaceful, so government had not prevented violence but had caused it. But since the terms of government seemed so sensible, for instance, it can speak of ensuring the security of all subjects. Quote, all ran headlong to their chains, believing they had secured their liberty. So Rousseau turned the whole story upside down. As a result, the lower classes were, quote, groaning under an iron yoke, the whole of humanity crushed by a handful of oppressors, who held sway over the weak, armed with the formidable strength of the law. But, he then concluded, the endless strife would make government unsustainable in the long run. And as a result he predicted that we are, quote, approaching a state of crisis and the age of revolutions. He said, I hold it to be impossible that the great monarchies of Europe still have long to survive. And indeed, the wealthy and powerful monarchy of France was removed during the French Revolution, in part due to his influence. As you might have noticed, his theory in many ways resembles Marxism, including his negative view on private property and his focus on inequality, and also his belief in the instability of the ruling classes, which would eventually result in revolution. Yet, other than Marx, Rousseau never advocated for an actual revolution, believing it to cause more problems than it solved. And there was one way that Rousseau was even ahead of Marx. For although critical of modern life, Rousseau did not believe that there was a viable way back to primitive days, including back to economic equality. And he did not wish to abolish people's ability to acquire property through their labor, as this would require the state to confiscate property, which would greatly increase the power of the state, which he sought to prevent. And indeed this was what happened when Marxist theories were put into practice in the 20th century. The increased power of the state and the mass confiscation of property. Given his strong critique on the Enlightenment, it might come as a surprise that Rousseau was initially on good terms with the major Enlightenment philosophers. For instance, he was good friends with Diderot, for whom he even wrote the entries on political economy and music in his famous Encyclopédie, the Great Enlightenment Encyclopedia. And he even visited Diderot daily when he was imprisoned and implored the authorities to release him. But as his deep skepticism toward the Enlightenment project intensified, his colleagues eventually began to see him as a traitor to their cause. Now back to his theory. So Rousseau saw no way back to our tribal days. But this didn't mean that we can't devise better ways of living, more in line with our true selves. For instance, he said we can educate our children differently, which he discussed in his book Émile. And I do have to say it is somewhat ironic that Rousseau wrote a book on education, as he had, quite shockingly, abandoned all of his 5 children to a public orphanage. But nevertheless, his book makes an interesting case. While the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke had claimed that children should be molded early on to instill in them liberal ideals, Rousseau believed that children should be allowed to develop naturally and at their own pace, and without overbearing adult expectations. A discussion in education that we still have to this day. And Rousseau also believed that there was a way to improve government, which he discussed in his work The Social Contract, which is an important term that he coined. And this work starts with his most famous line, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." His solution to this problem is quite in line with the other Enlightenment thinkers actually, despite his critique on them. For Rousseau recommended a government based on liberty and equality, in which all subjects gave up an equal amount of freedom. And as a result, he said, all subjects were equally sovereign, allowing no one to gain authority over others. Also in line with the Enlightenment, Rousseau advocated for religious tolerance, yet he did require that people at least believe in an omnipotent, intelligent, and beneficent divinity, which he deemed necessary for the stability of government, not an uncommon opinion at the time. And people should also swear an oath in which they agreed to respect the sanctity of the social contract. And more harshly, anyone who betrayed this oath should receive the death penalty. And now we finally come to what made Rousseau a true Romantic philosopher. Important to his philosophy of life was his love for nature, a word he capitalized because he considered it divine. For Rousseau often stood before nature in deep awe, seeing it as the work of the Creator. It was remarkable to him that people ever needed rituals or a sacred book with revelations, while they could also just immerse themselves in nature. In contrast, he claimed, traditional religion just led people to dominate one another by placing biblical authors and a priestly class between God and the believer. He wrote about this, "I would rather have heard God himself, so many men between God and me." And confronted by nature, especially our own nature, he claimed no artificial religion was ever needed. He expressed his love for nature most beautifully in his Reveries of the Solitary Walker, or Les Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire, which would become highly influential among later Romantics. Rousseau wrote this work near the end of his life, when his Enlightenment friends had abandoned him, and when his critique of Christianity got his books banned, and it made him for a while a fugitive from justice. In fact, he even had to travel incognito, and at one point villagers threw rocks at a house in which he was staying. Overwhelmed by all this, he quite understandably became paranoid, and at some point he could only find respite in solitude during his walks in nature, which filled him with ecstasy and purified his soul. In this work we follow him during a series of 10 walks, where he reminisces about nature and also about important experiences of his life. We read, for instance, of the pleasure he felt naming the plants still in flower in the meadows, and of a mountain gorge, where he found various plants, heard the cries of an owl and an eagle, and then sat down on pillows of lycopodium, believing he had found a hidden corner of the earth, where his persecutors would never find him. And during another walk, he recollected seeking refuge on an island in a lake in Switzerland, where he, quote, would have been content to live all my life without a moment's desire for any other state. And at times he would lay outstretched in a boat, drifting wherever the waters took him, quote, plunged into 1,000 indistinct and yet delightful reveries, already prefiguring the importance of daydream in the later Romantic period. Yet we read at other times he drifted into deep despair, insisting that all our plans for happiness are mere fantasy. During yet another walk, he got truly personal. He reminisced about how his love for an older married woman had shaped him when he was still a young man. He had been only 15 years old when the 29-year-old Swiss baroness, Madame de Varenne, took him into her home to become his tutor in philosophy and literature, but soon they also became lovers. And during this walk, it had been exactly 50 years since they first met. Despite the age gap, he remembered their time together as a period in his life in which he had been utterly himself. We read, I recall with joy and tenderness this unique and brief time of my life when I was myself, fully, without admixture and without obstacle, and when I can genuinely say that I lived. Without this short but precious time, I would perhaps have remained uncertain about myself. I would have difficulty unraveling what there is of my own in my own conduct. Beautiful introspection. This emphasis on the inner world can also be found in his work Julie, which became the most popular work of fiction in the late 18th century. The story tells of a young woman of noble birth named Julie, who falls in love with her tutor, Saint-Preux. Yet she was engaged to be married to someone else. When she eventually did marry, she fell into a deep depression and even died, unable to bear the pain of living without Saint-Preux. In line with the later Romantic period, the story showed that we better follow our deepest motivations, for denying them can come at a significant cost, for it can alienate us from ourselves. When writing Julie, Rousseau was himself in love with a married woman, named Sophie Udetot, but she did not reciprocate his feelings. In a number of letters to her, which he never sent, he described his love for her in terms that convey the intensity of his feelings and the richness of his inner world. We read of involuntary excitement, sublime frenzy, sacred fire, noble delirium, and so on. And in his Confessions, which we'll discuss shortly, he tells us how he got so infatuated thinking about Sophie that his knees grew weak. And in a moment of remarkable honesty, he scandalously admitted that he ejaculated to diffuse the buildup of tension in his body. Rousseau wrote his Confessions in 1769, but the work was published only after his death, although he did read excerpts publicly in the salons of Paris. The title of the work was a direct reference to the Confessions of St. Augustine, who also searched his quote, inner self and revealed even his darkest secrets to the public. But while St. Augustine wrote his autobiography to help others along their religious path, Rousseau's main purpose was, quote, to contribute to an accurate knowledge of my inner being in all the different situations of my life. That is, Rousseau's main motivation was to share his own inner world with the public, which he deemed original and interesting in and of itself. And to give a full, real picture of himself, he did not shy away from his scandalous deeds, as we have already seen, presenting himself as, quote, a singular soul, strange, and to say it all, a man of paradoxes. In contrast to St. Augustine, who journeyed inside of himself to find God, Rousseau hoped to discover and express his own unique hidden motives. And these motives, he claimed, have to be discovered deep within if we wish to live authentically, in line with our true selves, which later became an important romantic ideal. And this self, he added, was not the rational self of the Enlightenment, or even the moral self of Christianity, but the self that exists in the world of our feelings and memories. Again, a crucial romantic ideal. Especially love, he believed, can give a man, quote, new reasons to be himself. What a beautiful quote. At the start of the Confessions, Rousseau clearly set out his goal for the text. He wrote, I've begun on a work which is without precedent, whose accomplishment will have no imitator. I propose to set before my fellow mortals a man in all the truth of nature, and this man shall be myself. I've studied mankind and know my heart. I am not made like anyone I have been acquainted with, perhaps like no one in existence. And if not better, I at least claim originality, and whether nature has acted rightly or wrongly in destroying the mold in which she cast me can only be decided after I have been read. I will present myself, whenever the last trumpet shall sound, before the sovereign judge, that is God, with this book in my hand, and loudly proclaim, thus have I acted, these were my thoughts, such was I. With equal freedom and veracity have I related what was laudable and what was wicked. I have concealed no crimes, added no virtues. Such as I was, I have declared myself, sometimes vile and despicable, and at other times virtuous, generous and sublime. Even as thou hast read my inmost soul, power eternal, assemble round my throne an innumerable throng of my fellow mortals. Let them listen to my confessions. Let them blush at my depravity. Let them tremble at my sufferings. Let each in turn expose with equal sincerity the failings, the wanderings of the heart. And if he dare aver, I was better than that man. Among his many flaws, he tells us how he was beaten by a nanny as a child, which aroused sexual feelings in him. He tells of his habits of masturbation, his flawed relationship with women, and his abandonment of his children. And to include all this was not an act of humility or self-deprecation, but instead an honest account of the flaws that a generally good person might have. Never before did someone reveal his subjective experiences and emotions with such uncompromised openness and vulnerability. It is like we, for the first time in history, are meeting a true person. And thus unfolded the tumultuous but fascinating life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you were inspired. And if you want to learn more about the Enlightenment or the Romantic period, or any other topic from world history, then read my book, In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.